Don't speak English? What do you mean, don't speak English? Surely, if you want to learn English, then you need to speak English a lot. Well, yes, of course, that's true. However, it may be a good idea not to speak during the beginner and intermediate stages of learning English. Confused? Let me explain. I'm definitely not saying that you should never speak English. Of course, you need to speak English a lot to become a fluent English speaker. What I am saying is that it could be a good idea to go through a silent period during the beginner and intermediate stages of learning. What I mean is doing only listening during the beginner stages and no speaking, and maybe even during the B1 intermediate stage as well. So why? Why would it be a good idea not to speak for a period? You see, the problem with speaking English right from the beginner stages of learning is that you don't actually know what English is supposed to sound like yet. So what happens when you start speaking English right from the very beginning, right from the beginner stages of learning? The first thing that will happen is that you will translate from your native language into the target language. For example, in Spanish, if you want to say, I'm 24 years old, you have to say, tengo 24 años. The word tengo translates directly in English to I have, right? So the direct translation from Spanish to English is actually I have 24 years. But of course in English we need to say I am 24 years old. When a Spanish speaker starts talking English from the very beginner stages, quite often what happens is they start saying I have 24 years. If somebody asks them how old are you, they will say, I have 24 years, because it's a direct translation from Spanish. This then becomes their habit with speaking English for a long time. For a long time, they will say, I have 24 years. And they will say this maybe even when they're an intermediate speaker, they will still have this habit of saying, I have 24 years. On the other hand, if they had started their English learning journey with a silent period, if they had listened for 300 hours before they started speaking in the beginning, they would have never developed this bad habit. If they had listened to English for 300 hours before starting to speak, they would have heard native speakers say, I'm 24 years old, I'm 32 years old, I'm 67 years old. They would have heard this many, many times. So many times that when they start talking, they would never say, I have 24 years old, because it would sound wrong in English, because they would have heard it many times already from native speakers. If you're a Chinese student and you start speaking English right from the beginner stages, there's a good chance that you will not actually use the past tense when you need to. The reason for this is that Chinese doesn't actually have a past tense. And that's why Chinese people will often say things like, yesterday I go to the shops, or last week I see my friends, instead of yesterday I went to the shops and last week I saw my friends. They start talking this way using just the present tense earlier on in the beginner stages, and then this habit sticks with them for a long time. On the other hand, if they had gone through a silent period where they did not speak for, say, 300 hours, then they would have heard native speakers using the past tense a lot. They would have heard people saying, I went, I saw, I had, right? I ate, I drank. They would have heard this many times, and then when they started to speak, they would naturally start using the past tense in the same way they had already heard the native speakers doing it. And when they start saying something like, yesterday I go to the shops, they would have this feeling inside them like, that sounds kind of wrong. That doesn't sound right. For another example from Spanish, there's the word principal. For example, in Spanish, you might say la razón principal, which translates to English, the principal reason. Yes, the principal reason. The thing is, this is correct. You can say the principal reason I want to study English is because. But sounds kind of weird. This is not what native English speakers usually say. We don't say principal very much. Usually a native speaker would say the main reason I want to study English is. Now, if this Spanish speaker had instead gone through a silent period where they only listened to English for, let's say, 300 hours before they started to speak, they would never say things like the principal reason I want to travel, the principal reason I want to study English. They would not say that because they would have heard native speakers many times say the words, the main reason I want to travel, the main reason I want to study English. They would have heard this so many times that to then say the principal reason would sort of sound strange. They would have a feeling like this doesn't sound like proper English here. Do you see how going through a silent period before you start speaking can result in more natural word choices and less mistakes as well? I actually had my own experience of this studying Spanish. I started speaking Spanish from day one, from the beginner stages, which I think is not a good idea. I used to say the word esperomente, which would translate to hopefully in English. The problem is the word esperomente doesn't actually exist in Spanish. But I was using this word for 1 or 2 years. And why did this happen? Why did I create a word in my head that does not actually exist in Spanish? It's because I started speaking early. I translated from English, I said hopefully, and I translated it to esperomente because it follows the pattern of other similar words in English. So I kind of made a guess and I assumed that esperomente was a word in Spanish. However, if I had instead gone through a silent period in the beginning stages, I would never have started saying esperomente because I would not have heard any of the other native speakers that I was listening to say this word, and so I wouldn't use it myself. Another thing that happens when you start speaking English right from the beginner stages is that you tend to take the sounds from your native language and try and put them into English. For example, if you're a Russian speaker, if you come from Russia and you're a beginner English student and you try to start speaking as a beginner, instead of saying I want, you are quite likely to say I want. Yes? Why would a Russian speaker say I want instead of I want? It's because the English W does not exist in Russian. And so it would be natural for a Russian speaker to say I want. However, if this Russian speaker had instead gone through a silent period in the beginning stages, they did not speak for a long time, they would have heard many native speakers say I want, I want, I want, and they would not start pronouncing their W's as V's because they would have heard it many times spoken correctly. For another example, we could take a French person. Now, if a French person starts speaking English right from day one, right from when they were a beginner, it is quite likely that they will not actually pronounce their H sounds. Instead of saying hotel, they may say hotel. Instead of saying Harry Potter, they might say Harry Potter, right? Because this is a natural way for a French person to speak. This is how it would sound in French. However, if this French person had gone through a silent period and they had spent a lot of time listening before they started speaking, again, they would be less likely to have this problem. They may still have some problems with the H sound, but at least they would be very aware that it is not supposed to be hotel like in French. They would be very aware of this. They would know, Okay, it's supposed to be hotel, even if it is difficult to pronounce the H sound. At least they would know that it's supposed to sound like hotel and that it is not okay to say hotel. They would know this because they would have listened to native speakers saying the word hotel many times, and so they would know how it's supposed to sound. I have my own experience of this learning Spanish because, again, with Spanish, I started speaking immediately from day one. There's a word in Spanish called espero. Now, when I started speaking, I went to Google Translate and I translated I hope into Spanish, and the translation I got was this word here. So I started pronouncing it espero. Espero. This was kind of a guess for how to pronounce the word. I just assumed that it was pronounced espero, but actually the correct pronunciation is espero. And it took me around 2 years to notice that I was actually saying this very simple word wrong. However, if I had gone through a silent period before I started to speak, if I had listened to 300 hours of Spanish before I started speaking, I would have simply copied what I had already heard, and I would not make the pronunciation mistake. Can you see the benefits of going through a silent period where you only listen during the beginner and maybe even the B1 intermediate stage? So does that mean that if you go through a silent period in the beginning of learning English, that your pronunciation will be perfect because of this? Sadly, no. There will still be challenges with actually creating the sounds with your tongue and your lips and your mouth, okay? It can still be difficult to make the TH sound like this. It can still be difficult to make consonant cluster sounds like tasks and fixed. However, at least you will have a good idea for what it's supposed to sound like. Maybe you will find it difficult to create the sounds with your mouth, but you will know what it's supposed to sound like. If you just start talking from the beginner stages, you don't know what it's supposed to sound like, and so you will be making all kinds of pronunciation errors and also all kinds of unnatural word choices. Another benefit of going through a silent period before you start speaking English is that you don't have to speak until you're actually ready to speak. Because in the school system, when people learn languages at school, students are forced to speak English before they're really ready. Sometimes they have to speak in front of their whole class. They have to talk in front of everyone when they're not really ready to speak yet. They're going to talk, but they're going to be kind of guessing how they're supposed to speak. This can make a lot of students really very anxious and very worried about speaking because they're forced to speak in front of people, but they don't actually know how the language is supposed to sound. So they're sort of uncertain. They are not really sure if the way they are talking is correct because they haven't listened to much English. So really they are forced to talk before they're ready. By going through a silent period, it can be good for people who are scared of speaking because they don't have to speak until they feel a lot more confident of how the language is supposed to sound. Now, just as a side note, if you are somebody who is a bit scared of speaking, if you are somebody who is a bit nervous and you feel very nervous about speaking English, I'm afraid that this is not an excuse for you to hide away from speaking English. I'm sorry. You will still have to speak a lot of English to become fluent. You will need to get over your shyness and become more confident in speaking English. However, you can wait, so you can go for a silent period if you like, from the A1, A2, and even the B1 intermediate stages before you actually start to speak. You will still have to speak, I'm afraid, so you will have to get over your fear of speaking if you are scared to do it eventually. I don't want this video to be the reason that people just never speak English. No. You still have to speak. You need to speak a lot. But you can delay your speaking until your listening is quite a high level. So yeah, my personal recommendation for people learning any language, especially English, is to actually get to an intermediate B1 level of listening before you even say your first word in the language. If you think that sounds a bit crazy, then remember this video is called an alternative way to learn English. It is not the traditional way to learn. Now, obviously, if you can understand this video, it probably means that you have at least a B1 or higher intermediate level of English. And so many of you probably have already been speaking a lot. Most of you probably have been speaking English right from when you were a beginner. So does that mean that your English is ruined forever? No, don't worry, okay? Yes, it would have been better to go for a silent period in the beginning. And yes, you may have a few mistakes that you still have from that period, but it's not a big deal, okay? Don't worry too much, okay? You can still become very good at English. You can still get an advanced level of English, so don't worry too much if you did not go through a silent period, okay? There's no need to panic. Now, some people really cannot go through a silent period. For example, if you are living in an English-speaking country, if you're living in the UK and you're living in America or the USA, then you maybe cannot really go through a silent period. Maybe you do need to talk every day of your life to get by, to get on the bus or to use the train or to go to the supermarket. Maybe you have to speak English and you have no choice. That's fine. If you have to speak English, then you can. It's okay. And some of you maybe just really enjoy speaking English. You just love to talk. You really enjoy speaking. I'm not going to stop you from speaking if you really like it, but I would suggest that there are a lot of benefits to not speaking for a while and going for a silent period. Now, if you're a slightly crazy person, if you're a bit obsessive, you can, if you like, go for a silent period all the way from the A1 beginner level, all the way up into the upper intermediate B2 level. If you want, you can do only listening from A1 to B2 before you even start speaking. This is what many people call the pure method, and I will do a video on the pure method later on. I don't recommend this for most people, but some of you, maybe slightly crazy people, want to try listening only from A1 beginner all the way to B2. Bear in mind, this could mean doing 2 years of English without saying a word, 2 years of just listening to English that whole time. So it is slightly crazy. However, I think it is actually a very good way to learn a language. I will do another video on the pure method very soon. Anyway, guys, I'm sure that some people will disagree with this video. Remember, this is an alternative way to study English. It is not the traditional way. So it is not the normal way to study. It's an alternative way. If you have any other questions, please feel free to put them in the comments section below. And thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one. Hello guys. If you want more videos, go to EnglishSponge.com. On the website, you will find videos from many different teachers, some British teachers and some American teachers. The videos are organized by level A1, A2, B1 and B2, so you can choose which level you want to listen to. So go to EnglishSponge.com. The link is in the description of the video.